One old woman, one small act of disrespect, and one truth that turned an entire room upside down. Most people didn't even notice her at first. It was a bright Thursday afternoon in Savannah, Georgia, and the kind of heat that clung to your skin like syrup hung in the air. On River Street, tourists ducked in and out of little shops, licking melting ice cream cones and laughing. A few blocks over, tucked into a side street lined with magnolia trees, sat Harper's, one of the city's more polished restaurants, polished enough that you could smell the expensive cologne before you even pushed through the front doors. That's where Clara Baines showed up, wearing a pressed powder blue dress and white low-heeled shoes that made a soft tap with every careful step. Her hair, silver and pinned neatly at the back, gleamed in the sunlight as she opened the heavy glass door. In her right hand, she carried an old brown fedora, her late husband's favorite. She paused for a second just inside, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer lighting. The place was nearly half empty. Waiters in crisp shirts and ties bustled from table to table, pouring water and setting down plates with the kind of precision that said, "Tips here didn't come cheap." Clara smiled softly. She loved places like this, not because of the linen napkins or the big fancy menus, but because Walter had loved them. He always said, "Treat yourself like you matter, because you do, Clara." She straightened her shoulders and took a few steps toward the hostess stand. That's when Jeremy Landon spotted her. Jeremy was 24, maybe 25. Tall, with sandy blonde hair he kept slicked back a little too tightly, and the kind of smirk that never quite reached his eyes. He had already sized her up the second she walked in. The old dress, the scuffed shoes, the way she clutched that hat. He didn't see a customer. He saw someone who, in his mind, didn't belong here. Clara waited patiently for him to approach, still holding her gentle smile. He didn't smile back. Instead, he pulled out a small black booklet, pretending to check something, and said without even looking at her, "We're full today. Private event. Sorry." His words hit like a slap, but Clara didn't flinch. She had been through too much in her lifetime to be rattled by a rude young man. She looked around. 4 empty tables near the windows, 2 more along the back wall. Full? Clara's smile dimmed just a little. Not enough to show anger. Just enough to show she noticed the lie. "Are you sure?" she asked kindly, her voice warm, touched by years of grace and patience. "I was invited for a luncheon." Jeremy shrugged without meeting her eyes. "Reservations only." Clara's fingers tightened slightly around the brim of Walter's hat. She could feel the other diners glancing over now, their conversations dipping quieter, their forks pausing halfway to their mouths. But nobody said a word. Not yet. But something in the air had shifted, like the first crack before a dam breaks. Jeremy was already halfway turned around, walking off toward the kitchen like he had more important things to do, when a voice called out from the bar. "Hey man, she said she has an invitation." It was a man in his late 30s, sitting with a woman who looked just as uncomfortable. Both of them wore expensive watches and stiff smiles, the kind people put on when they see something wrong but aren't sure if stepping in will make it worse. Jeremy ignored them. Clara, still standing alone at the hostess stand, pressed the hat a little closer to her chest. She could feel the heat crawling up her neck, but not from embarrassment. It was that quiet kind of anger, the kind you learn to live with over the years. She tried again. "Sir, my son made the arrangements. There's a luncheon here today, I'm quite sure." Jeremy spun back around, giving her a tight, fake smile, the kind that said he wasn't sorry at all. "Like I said, ma'am, we're booked. Maybe you could try somewhere else?" he said, loud enough that a few nearby tables turned their heads. Clara's mouth tightened into a small line, but she kept her voice even. "And where exactly do you suggest I go, dressed like this with no car in this heat?" Jeremy didn't answer. He didn't need to. His face said it all. Not his problem. The woman at the bar shifted in her seat, glancing nervously at her husband. A younger couple at a corner table whispered to each other, stealing glances at Clara like she was some kind of sideshow they didn't want to be caught watching. But no one moved. No one stood up. Clara felt it then. That old, familiar loneliness that had followed her through bus stations, doctor's offices, department stores, all the quiet places where people pretend not to see. Still, she stood a little taller. "I'll wait here," she said softly. Jeremy gave a short laugh under his breath and walked away, disappearing into the kitchen. Behind her, a soft voice said, "Ma'am, you're welcome to sit at our table if you'd like." Clara turned to see an older woman, maybe in her late 60s, with kind brown eyes and a worried expression. She sat next to a teenage boy who looked just as uncertain. Clara smiled, truly smiled, for the first time since she walked in. "Thank you, dear," she said, "but I'll wait for my son." And she did. Minutes stretched long and thin. The clatter of silverware, the murmur of conversations, the shifting of chairs, all of it wrapped around Clara like a heavy blanket she couldn't shrug off. She kept her eyes fixed on the door, her back straight, her shoes planted firm on the marble floor. But just when it seemed like the world might move on without her, the front door swung open. And everything changed. The door creaked open hard enough to rattle the little bell above it. In walked a tall man in a tailored gray suit, his stride confident, his eyes scanning the room with the sharpness of someone who was used to reading people in seconds. Calvin Baines, Clara's son. At 46, Calvin had the kind of presence that made rooms shift without him saying a word. His skin was deep brown, his hair clipped short and neat, and his gold cufflinks caught the light when he moved. He spotted his mother immediately, and he also saw Jeremy, leaning against the hostess stand, pretending to fiddle with a tablet. Calvin's face didn't change much, just a slight tightening around the eyes, the kind that said he knew exactly what had just happened. He crossed the lobby in long, easy steps and kissed his mother's cheek. "Sorry I'm late, Mama," he said, voice low but warm. Clara just smiled, like nothing was wrong, but her fingers lingered on his sleeve a second longer than usual, a small gesture. But Calvin caught it. He turned to Jeremy. "We have a reservation under Baines," he said evenly. Jeremy's mouth twitched. For a second it looked like he might double down, but then his gaze flicked to Calvin's watch, a sleek, heavy Rolex, and the polished leather briefcase in his hand. Something clicked behind his eyes. Yes sir, one moment," Jeremy stammered, tapping quickly on the screen. "Private event. Right this way." Now the other diners were really paying attention. Heads tilted, forks froze halfway to mouths. Even the manager at the back, a short woman with a headset tucked behind her ear, started drifting closer. Calvin didn't move. He let the silence stretch just long enough for Jeremy to squirm. "My mother," Calvin said, his voice carrying just enough, "was just told there was no room for her. Interesting how that changes when I show up." Jeremy flushed bright red. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't realize." Calvin cut him off with a small, sharp smile. "No, you realized exactly what you wanted to realize." The air in the restaurant turned thick, like everybody had sucked in a breath and didn't know how to let it go. Clara touched Calvin's arm again, gently. It wasn't a warning. It was a reminder of who she was, of who they were. "We'll find our table," she said softly. But Calvin wasn't finished yet. He turned to the room, to every pair of eyes that had watched it happen, that had turned away, that had chosen silence. "My mother is Clara Baines," he said, voice calm but strong. "She was one of the first black women to serve as a federal judge in this state. She helped fight for the rights that make this place what it is today. You didn't see a customer when she walked in. You saw something you thought didn't belong." The words hit the air like stones thrown into glass. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Clara, proud and steady, nodded once to her son. Then she turned and walked toward the reserved section, Walter's hat still cradled in her hands. But Calvin stayed back for one more moment, watching the faces around him shift from guilt to shame to something deeper, something they couldn't hide anymore. The private room was tucked away in the back, behind a pair of heavy oak doors that still creaked on their hinges. Clara stepped through them slowly, her shoes clicking against the polished floor. Inside, a small crowd had already gathered. Faces lit up when they saw her. Old colleagues, younger lawyers she had mentored, city officials, even a local reporter scribbling furiously in a notebook. A banner stretched across the far wall. "Celebrating Clara Baines, a legacy of justice and grace." Clara paused. She hadn't expected all this. A short, stocky man in a navy blazer hurried over and pressed her hands in his. "Judge Baines," he said, almost out of breath. "It's an honor to have you here today." Behind him, a table was set up with framed photos, snapshots of Clara shaking hands with governors, standing on courthouse steps, holding protest signs back when those things could still get you arrested, or worse. Clara smiled, but a tightness still sat heavy in her chest. She looked back toward the restaurant's main room, where Jeremy was no doubt still standing, where strangers were still whispering, pretending not to see what had just played out right in front of them. Calvin followed her gaze and leaned in. "You want me to say something?" he asked under his breath. Clara shook her head. "No, baby," she said. "Sometimes the best lessons are the ones people have to sit with." The luncheon started slow, with plates clattering and servers moving nervously around the room. Jeremy didn't come near the private section. Neither did the manager, who had disappeared completely. At the head table, Clara finally set Walter's hat down beside her plate. She folded her hands neatly on her lap and listened as one speaker after another stood up to talk about everything she had done, all the court cases she had argued, all the doors she had kicked open for those who came after her. But none of them knew the real story. None of them knew about the mornings Clara sat outside job interviews, praying she wouldn't be judged before she even shook a hand, or the grocery store aisles where people stepped around her like she wasn't even there, or the nights she cried in the dark when Walter wasn't looking, wondering if it would ever get better. She didn't tell those stories. She wore them instead, like armor, like grace, stitched into every fiber of her being. When it was finally her turn to speak, Clara stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her dress. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice, though soft, filled the room. "I'm grateful for this honor," she began, her eyes shining. "But understand this. The work isn't finished. It's not about titles. It's not about awards. It's about how you treat the people you think can do nothing for you." She paused, letting the words settle. "It's about kindness. It's about courage. It's about choosing to see someone, really see them, when the world tells you to look away." A silence thicker than anything that had hung over the restaurant earlier blanketed the room now. One by one, people rose to their feet, not because they were supposed to, but because they understood. At least some of them did. Calvin clapped too, his hands slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving his mother's face. It wasn't just pride he felt, it was awe, because she hadn't just lived through history, she was history. But outside those oak doors, the real test waited, and Jeremy Landon wasn't the only one who had some learning to do. After the speeches, after the clapping, after the polite slices of cake and the snapping of a few pictures, Clara sat quietly by the window, sipping iced tea and watching the slow drift of the afternoon sun across the brick sidewalk outside. Calvin pulled up a chair beside her. "You all right, Mama?" he asked. She smiled softly, her eyes never leaving the window. "I'm all right," she said. "I've been all right for a long time." There was a long pause between them, the kind that doesn't need filling. Inside the main dining room, the noise of plates and laughter had picked back up, but it sounded different now. Thinner somehow, like everyone was still a little shaken. Jeremy Landon hadn't come back. Neither had the manager. Maybe they were hiding. Maybe they were embarrassed. Maybe they were just hoping the whole thing would blow over. Clara wasn't concerned with them anymore. She was thinking about something her father had once told her, sitting on the porch of their little shotgun house in Macon, long before the world had cracked open and let her dreams slip through. "Sometimes people don't hate you, Clara," he'd said, rocking slow in his chair. "They just don't know how to see you." She understood that better now. Hate was easy to spot. It burned bright and loud. You could brace yourself for it. But being unseen, being dismissed before you even said a word, that was quieter, slower, like a slow leak in a tire you didn't even realize was going flat until you found yourself stranded on the side of the road. Calvin followed her gaze out the window. "You think he'll change?" he asked quietly. Clara shrugged. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not. But the important thing is what he does when nobody's looking, what he chooses next." They sat there a little while longer. At one point, the older woman from the bar, the one who had offered Clara a seat, drifted over, her hands twisting nervously at her sides. "I just wanted to say," she started, then trailed off. "I'm sorry. I should have said more earlier." Clara smiled up at her, reaching out to pat the woman's hand. "You said plenty, dear," Clara said kindly. "You showed kindness. That's what matters." The woman blinked fast, nodded, and hurried back to her table. Calvin leaned back in his chair, exhaling slow. "You always find a way to forgive," he said, almost amazed. Clara chuckled, the sound rich and full. Baby, forgiveness isn't about pretending something didn't happen, she said. It's about refusing to let it harden you. She reached for Walter's hat, running her fingers along the worn brim. I spent too many years fighting to be seen to start carrying bitterness now, she added. That's not the legacy I want to leave. Calvin nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep into his chest. It wasn't about winning battles. It wasn't even about being right. It was about leaving a light on, even when people tried their best to live in the dark. And sometimes it was about sitting quietly at a table, proud, patient, steady, until the world had no choice but to look up and see you. But as they stood to leave, and Clara tucked Walter's hat under her arm, one last surprise was waiting just outside those glass doors. The afternoon sun had stretched long shadows across the sidewalk by the time Clara and Calvin stepped outside. The heavy glass door swung shut behind them with a soft thud. And there he was, Jeremy Landon, standing awkwardly off to the side, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He wasn't wearing the fake smile this time. His eyes, usually darting and busy, were still now. He shifted from one foot to the other, glancing once at Calvin, but mostly keeping his gaze locked somewhere near Clara's shoes. It took him a second to speak. "I'm sorry," he said, the words small and rough. "I judged you. I shouldn't have. I'm really sorry." For a moment, Clara just looked at him, not with anger, not with pity, not even with sadness, just with a kind of quiet study, like she was weighing something invisible between them. Then she smiled. Not wide, but real. "Thank you," she said simply. No long speech, no lecture, no dramatic scene, just those two words. Because forgiveness isn't about making the other person feel better. It's about setting yourself free. Jeremy gave a small nod, barely more than a dip of the head, and disappeared back inside. Calvin opened the passenger door for Clara, helping her into the car like he always did. As he buckled himself in, he glanced at her, expecting maybe she'd have something more to say about what just happened. But she didn't. She just set Walter's old hat on her lap, folded her hands neatly, and stared out the window as the car pulled away. There was peace in her face, the kind of peace that didn't come from easy victories, but from a lifetime of choosing dignity over bitterness, grace over rage, forgiveness over pride. As they drove through the old brick streets of Savannah, past the leaning oak trees and sleepy cafes, Calvin thought about how easy it would have been for his mother to meet hate with hate, disrespect with anger. But she didn't. She never had. And in doing so, she left something bigger behind, something stronger than any courtroom legacy or news article ever could. She left an example, one that even strangers like Jeremy would carry with them, quietly, maybe without even knowing it. Because sometimes the biggest changes don't happen in courtrooms. They don't happen in parades or on television. They happen in the small, uncomfortable moments when someone realizes they were wrong and decides to be better. Every day, we walk past people we don't see. We size them up. We put them in categories without even realizing it. We tell ourselves little lies to make it easier. They probably don't belong here, or someone else will speak up. But dignity isn't something we hand out when we think someone deserves it. Respect isn't a prize. Kindness isn't a performance. It's what you do when nobody's clapping for you. So next time, the next stranger you see, the next moment you feel that little flicker of judgment, stop. Look again. Choose to see, because the world doesn't change all at once. It changes one small human decision at a time, starting with you.